Welcome to today's video. Today I'm going to be painting this beautiful floral freesia flower. So regardless of your skill level, join me as we are going to explore simple techniques and tips to get you started with watercolor. Alright, let me quickly explain how I sketched this freesia flower. I worked on the composition in my sketchbook first. I try to create a balanced composition by adding open flowers with small buds on a long stem. Then I transfer it to a tracing paper. Then using a lighting board, I transfer from the tracing paper to the watercolor paper. There are different ways of transferring images, but I'll discuss those in another video. My drawing was inspired by Helen Cousin's video, where she explained how to paint the freesia bud. You can find the link to her video in the description below. After watching her video, I felt inspired to create a larger composition featuring the flowers and buds. So I decided to start by drawing the bud in the middle of my composition and then adding 2 open flowers on the side, along with a few more small buds at the end of the stem. In this floral study, we get a better view of both the inside and outside of the flowers, not just the buds. So if you want to follow along and paint with me, you can download the drawing using the link in the description. Now, let's discuss the materials I'll be using. I have French ultramarine and permanent rose from Winsor Newton, and Chrome Yellow, which is an old paint in my palette, but I'm not sure of the brand. These are all primary colors, making it easy to mix and create a simple color scheme. Now about the brushes I'll be using. Since the drawing isn't very big, I don't need large brushes. I mainly use size 6 round brushes. I have 2 synthetic and 1 sable here with me, but I will likely use 1 synthetic for most of the painting and the sable brush to apply water because it's softer. I also have size 2 and 0 for smaller details, and this tiny brush for those very thin lines will be adding to each petal. If you don't have a tiny brush like this, you can use a regular brush that has a point tip. I'll demonstrate later on. Here I made a color swatch to see how I could mix the purple color I needed for this flower. I mixed blue with the pink to create some shades of purple for the flowers. I will mix more than 1 shade of purple to create a more natural appearance. So it's not going to be just 1 purple for the whole petal. I also did the same with blue and yellow to mix green, so I'll be using different shades of green as well, light and dark shades. I begin by painting the bud that Helen Cousins demonstrated in her video. I won't go into detail about this step here, as you can find the link in the description. I highly recommended watching her video because she explained the painting techniques such as wet on wet, wet on dry, applying details and glazing. I'll fast forward this step, and when I start painting the flower, I'll explain my approach. Alright, now that I've finished painting the bud, it's time to work on the flower. The first step is to apply clean water to each petal. Take it one petal at a time. Don't wet all the petals simultaneously. Start with one petal, then move on to another that isn't next to it. If you wet a petal next to the one you just finished, the colors may blend, and we want to avoid that. Apply clean water lightly, just enough to dampen the paper without creating puddles. This allows us to work in layers, creating a soft blend between them. Next, you begin by adding purple to the edges of the petals. Then, with a clean damp brush, you pull the pen towards the middle of the petal. So this technique helps to create highlights by leaving lighter areas in the petal. Now I'm using the tiny brush to create the lines I mentioned earlier. If you don't have a small brush like this, you can use the same size 6 brush as long as it has a thin pointed tip. For example, I'm using my silver silk brush for the other parts of the painting, which has a very fine point that allows me to create thin lines as well. I'll demonstrate this later on. To create highlights in watercolor, you just have to leave parts of the white paper without paint, or with a light layer of paint. We don't use white paint very often in watercolor. Typically, the darker areas represent shadows. In this instance, we have 2 petals above the one I'm currently working on. So to create the shadow effect, I'm adding slightly more dark colors to the side of this petal, as you can see. So this helps simulate the shadow cast by the petals above it. I forgot to mention earlier, but it's important to always pay attention to the light source. Think about where the light is coming from and where shadows should be created. Now, I've shifted my focus to the base of the flower. I need to let the petal I just painted dry before I can work on the next one. This part of the flower is very light yellow with mostly white. So I'm adding just a touch of yellow. And since we don't paint with white, because the paper is bright white, we simply leave it as it is. I apply the yellow and blend it gently to create a soft, subtle effect. Now, I move on to the next petal since the first one I painted is already dry. It's important to work on one petal at a time because if you work on them all together, the paint will spread onto all the petals, which isn't what we want. I'm emphasizing this all the time because I made the mistake myself when I was painting the first bud. I applied water to 2 leaves at the same time and the paint bled to the other one that was supposed to. Then I had to pat dry with some paper towel to continue, so keep that in mind. I know sometimes we just want to speed up the process. Now, you notice that I once again working on the thin lines, but this time I'm using the size 6 silver silk. It has a very fine point that allows me to create these lines without needing to switch brushes. So if you have a brush with a similar point tip, you don't need to have a separate tiny brush for these lines. Now I started painting the leaves at the base of the flower using the same technique. First I apply water, then I add a very light shade of green. Always start very light with your layers. After that you can add darker shades to build up the layers, followed by adding a few lines and details to the leaves. There's another leaf next to it, but I won't paint it yet because I need to wait for the first one to dry. Instead, I'll start on the leaves of the next flower. Once I finished the leaf, I chose not to return to the flower immediately. I still needed to add glazing to create more shadows and highlights on those petals. However, since it's not dry yet, I'll continue work on the stem of the flower for now. Let me tell you a quick story about how I came up with all the art materials I have now. When I started with watercolor, I only had a lousy kids watercolor set from my daughter, which I used only to create a few marks on the paper. To be honest, I liked watercolor, but I didn't enjoy it much because of the quality of paper and paint that I was using. Then in 2019, my sister-in-law gave me a travel set from Winsor Newton, Cotman 12 colors, that she got from my sister but she wasn't using, then she gave it to me. That's when I started enjoying watercolor. Then about 2 years later, in 2021, I bought a large set also from Winsor Newton, but with 45 colors, I think. However, I was still using student grade art materials, and I continued with student grade up to last year, February 2023. That's when I got artist grade materials. And it was a potluck marketplace. This woman in my town was selling a box full of paints, brushes and art materials for only £20. I didn't know what exactly I was getting, but the price was too good for the amount of materials inside the box, so I guess I didn't care what I would get. Only when I got home I realized how lucky I was. All paints, artist grade, Winsor Newton, CND, SAA, brushes, most Sable, and a lot of other materials like brush cleaner, masking fluid, mediums, and a bunch of gouache and acrylic paint as well. Then the next day I went back to get a bundle of watercolor paper sheets that she was only selling for £10. All paper 100% cotton, 300 GSM, hot and cold press. Sadly, her father passed away and she was selling all his art materials. I'm grateful that I had this opportunity to buy all those materials for a very cheap price, otherwise I wouldn't be able to buy all from new. So if you want to start with watercolor but you are concerned about spending too much money on new materials, search second-hand websites. You could get a great deal. Now I'm adding a warm shade of green. To achieve this, I mixed a bit of permanent rose to the green mix to create a brownish color. This warm green adds a natural appearance to the stem. Now I'm going to paint the small buds at the end of the stem. These buds will be green-yellow because they haven't bloomed yet. They are still new and closed, not showing any flower. So there won't be any purple on them, just green and yellow. I started with watercolor back in 2018, but it wasn't till last year that I started practicing almost every day. Over the past year, I've seen a significant improvement in my skills, but I know there's still a lot more to learn and improve. If you are hesitant about starting watercolor, don't be. It's a rewarding hobby and even a potential career path. Who knows where it might lead you? I hope my journey serves as inspiration for you to dive in and explore watercolor painting. Okay, next I'm going back to painting the leaves of the first flower. I'm working on the second leaf now. The first one has already dried. So the process is the same as before. Water, light layer, darker layer, and details. Now I'm going to apply glazing to the first flower. I start by adding clean water to the petals. I'm using a sable brush because it's softer, which helps prevent damaging the paper or disturbing the paints I've applied earlier. Then I add drops of paint, especially on the parts that need to be darker, like the shadows. I begin with purple and then add a bit of blue to achieve a more natural appearance. If you don't have sable brushes, because I know they're quite expensive, try to use the softest brush you have to apply water to paper. Now I move on to the second petal. I just need to ensure that the previous petal isn't too wet. It doesn't have to be completely dry, but it shouldn't be so wet that it blends into the pattern I'm currently working on. Otherwise, the colors will mix, so it's best if it's almost dry. Then I continue adding the same darker shades of purple and blue to create texture and a natural appearance. Here I'm still working on the details of the petal, adding lines along the edges and in the center. I've chosen to stick with my silver silk brush because its fine tip is perfect for these lines. Now I'm painting a small part of one of the petals that is behind, so you can't see the entire petal, just a small tip peeking out. Now let's focus on the last flower. This flower is facing towards us, giving a different look and feel compared to the other one. Because of this angle, we can clearly see the center of the flower, which slopes downwards. To capture this perspective and depth accurately, it's important to paint the lines in the right direction and angle. Ensuring that the curves follow the correct path is crucial for creating the illusion of depth and perspective in this particular view of the flower. I keep using the tip of my brush to add a small amount of purple paint. Then I add yellow to the center of the flower. It's important to be cautious here because when yellow mixes with purple, it can turn into a grayish color. So take your time and work in small steps. If needed, let the purple dry a bit before adding the yellow, but not too dry, otherwise it will create a hard edge. On these petals, there's a slightly wavy texture visible unlike the other flower. I'm using the tip of my brush to add darker shades of purple and blue to create that texture effect. Alright, now I'm focused on adding shadows to the petals underneath. Since these petals on top cast shadows on the ones beneath, we have to create those shadows to convey depth and perspective. To achieve this, I'm using dark shades of purple and blue. As I keep adding details to the petals, you notice I'm working on more than one petal at a time, but those petals are opposite on the flower, so the colors don't mix. Also, since the paint and paper are slightly damp, I can still work on a petal next to the other without worrying about smudging or blending too much. Now I've moved on to the final phase of the painting, which will be the last step. These are the small buds I mentioned earlier. Since the flowers haven't bloomed yet, the buds will be painted in yellow and green. Because the buds are closed, we don't see any part of the flower yet, so I begin by using a very light yellow. Then I gradually add layers and texture with various shades of green. Alright, as I finish up these small buds, I've reached the final step of this painting. It feels good to see it all coming together, finally. Just to let you know, I worked on this painting over 3 different days instead of doing it all at once. If you decided to do it in one sitting, I think it might take around 1 to 2 hours. But I decided to spread it out due to time limitations. Despite taking 3 days, I enjoy the process very much. This style of floral painting isn't the quick one, loose kind that you finish in minutes. It requires attention to detail and multiple layers. That's it. I finally finished the whole floral composition. What a journey. I wanted to add the name of the flower using brush and watercolor, but after trying out on this paper, I wasn't happy with the result, as you can see. So instead, I opted for a fine liner ink. I wrote the name first with a pencil to avoid mistakes, then traced it over with the ink. This is a Unipin 0.5 and I chose the dark gray ink. I also have a lighter gray, but I decided to go with dark gray, but not black, as I felt black would be too strong for this painting. Adding the name gives a nice finishing touch to the painting, but of course, leaving it out without a name is also fine. It all depends on taste and how you would like to present your final art. Now, if you have any suggestions for what I should paint next, please leave a comment below, and if you haven't done already, please subscribe to the channel. I have plans to create more floral paintings and other subjects as well, so you can receive notifications when I post more videos. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Keep painting and enjoy the process. Bye for now.